Welcome to the fourth lecture in the Henry VIII series. Today we will examine how Henry achieved an annulment by 1534 through radical legislation that broke England away from the Catholic Church. This is a famous event in English history known as the Break with Rome. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. The first section will examine the origins of the Protestant faith with the ideas of Martin Luther. Then we will examine followers of Martin Luther who gathered around Henry at court and provided him with a radical solution to his great matter. We will then examine a chronology of key events and parliamentary legislation that severed the ties between England and the Church in Rome. This ultimately allowed Henry to grant his own annulment and marry Anne Boleyn. Finally, we will evaluate the different motivations that Henry had for the break with Rome and how this changed over time. Let's first examine the Protestant ideas that originated in Germany 10 years prior to Henry's search for an annulment. In 1517, a priest called Martin Luther pinned a list of complaints to the door of his local church in Wittenberg. It was quite normal at the time to use the church door to publish bulletins and announcements. However, the list of complaints that he wrote were quite unique. There were 95 complaints in total, known as the 95 Theses. Luther did not intend to start an entirely new religion, but his complaints caused such an outrage that he was excommunicated from the church. He was told to recant his beliefs, which Luther refused to do. He began to attract followers. They would become the founding members of the Protestant faith. These early followers were known as Lutherans, as they were followers of Luther. Let's now examine some of the key complaints that Luther made. The first and most controversial of his complaints was against indulgences. These were payments that people made to the church in order to be pardoned for their sins. They had become common practice all across Europe, and the highest members of the church were exploiting the normal people out of their money. The policy was made worse when Pope Leo X started to sell indulgences in order to fund the building of St. Peter's Basilica in the heart of Vatican City. Luther hated the practice of indulgences. He considered it to be evidence of the church's corruption, since the practice exploited the poor and advantaged the rich. Luther questioned the need for penance, especially having to pay for forgiveness for sins. Instead, Luther believed that a person's individual faith in Jesus and his teachings should be sufficient in order to enter heaven after death. This was called justification through faith. It means that there was no pressure to pay out for pardons whenever a person committed a sin. It also challenged the concept of purgatory, which was the place the soul entered to be cleansed and ready for heaven, especially since there was no reference to purgatory in the Bible. Luther's third complaint was of the Bible and church services. During the 16th century, both the Bible and church services were in Latin, the language of Rome. However, this meant that the ordinary people could not understand what was being said during Sunday Mass and therefore did not know which rules were invented by the church and which ones were part of Scripture, in other words, in the Bible. This meant that most ordinary people remained ignorant of the true Word of God. Luther wished to change this by introducing the vernacular, in other words, the language spoken in each region. He wrote the Bible in German and encouraged his followers to perform Mass in the language of their congregation. Luther also believed that priests should be allowed to marry, known as clerical marriage, as he believed that marriage should not prevent a priest from performing his duties. It was also an open secret that many priests had mistresses and broke their vow of celibacy, so it would prevent this from being such a problem. In 1521, Henry wrote a large treaty in defense of the doctrine of the Catholic Church against the heresy of Luther. This led to him being awarded the title of Defender of the Faith by the Pope. This is important because it proves that Henry was never himself a true follower of Martin Luther. He was led down the path of what he considered heretical ideas as a means to an end in order to ensure his annulment. Let's now examine Luther's followers in England. By 1527 there was an underground circle of Lutherans, and the first printed copy of the Bible in English written in the early 1520s by an English Lutheran called William Tyndale. However, it was illegal to have a copy of the Tyndale Bible, and if these underground groups were caught they could be persecuted, even killed, for heresy. However, the failure of the Blackfriars Court changed everything. Lutherans at court began to reveal their beliefs. The first Lutheran of note was a young priest called Thomas Cranmer, who had spent time on the continent and was brave enough to voice new and bold solutions to Henry's problem after the breakdown of the Blackfriars Court. As a dean of Cambridge University, he helped to assemble a large collection of religious arguments aimed at justifying Henry's annulment, called the Collectanea. He was then given the surprising promotion to Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533. Despite being a lesser-known member of the clergy, by accelerating Cranmer's career in this way, Henry was essentially able to control his actions as the most senior member of the church. Cranmer was therefore responsible for some of the more controversial actions as part of the break with Rome, such as the sham divorce hearing and the secret wedding of Henry to Anne Boleyn. Finally, there was Anne Boleyn. Whilst the Hollywood blockbusters liked to focus on how she seduced Henry into going to extreme lengths to achieve his annulment, historians have focused on her religious beliefs and how they came to influence Henry. It is believed that it was Boleyn who first introduced Henry to the Tyndale Bible, and that she helped to persuade Henry that he would not be going against God if he was to break away from the corrupt Catholic Church. Let's now examine the series of events that led to the break with Rome. We will start by looking at corruption of the English Church. Parliament had become increasingly vocal in its criticisms of church corruption even before the Blackfriars Court. There were cases of simony, which is the selling of church positions to family members or acquaintances. Pluralism, when powerful members of the church held more than one position so could collect from multiple revenue streams. There were also cases of miscarriages of justice. For example, in 1514 a particularly controversial case came to be discussed in Parliament, known as the Hun case. This was when an English merchant called Richard Hun was murdered in his prison cell because he was refusing to pay mortuary fees to the church for the funeral of his infant son. The church was almost certainly responsible for Richard Hun's murder. The case caused widespread criticism across London and highlighted key problems with the church, especially since they had independence over their own law courts and prisons. By 1529, Wolsey had come to epitomize the corruption of powerful church members. He held multiple bishoprics alongside his position as Archbishop of York. He was incredibly wealthy, shown by his building of the large palaces of Hampton Court and York's Place. And it was an open secret that he had a long-term mistress. He quite clearly used his elevated status to wield significant power and influence. This made it easy for members of the House of Commons to openly despise him. It also explains why he was charged with praemunire, in other words, placing a higher authority above the king, just before he died. For 2 years after the breakdown of the Blackfriars Court in 1529, not much happened to progress the annulment. Between 1530 and 1531, Henry tasked the best theologians and scholars of the universities to study arguments that would justify his annulment. As part of this, they also began to study the concept of English sovereignty and whether or not Henry needed the Pope's permission for the annulment. These arguments were all put together into what is known as the Collectanea. Thomas Cranmer was one of the main scholars who worked on this project, and it is for this reason that he was then promoted to Archbishop of Canterbury. Once religious arguments had been established, Thomas Cranmer worked to ensure the obedience of the clergy, especially the bishops. Parliament charged every member of the clergy with praemunire since they were essentially serving the Pope as a higher authority than the king. Then in 1532 the clergy were expected to sign a declaration that they owed their allegiance first and foremost to the king and not the pope. This is known as the submission of the clergy. The next key steps show a significant shift in the role of the monarch and parliament. This has led historians to use the phrase king in parliament to describe the way that Henry placed pressure on members of parliament, both in the Commons and the Lords, to pass groundbreaking legislation that would break England's ties with Rome and give Henry as king full sovereignty over his own laws. Behind the scenes, however, it was Thomas Cromwell who was engineering these acts of parliament. In 1532, there were two significant acts of parliament, which were originally designed to place pressure on the Pope to grant the annulment. The first of these is called the conditional restraint of annates. Conditional means it was not yet permanent, restraint of annates means the restraint or withholding of something, and annates were an annual tax paid to the Pope in Rome by the English Church. Therefore, this law essentially withheld money usually paid to the papacy in order to place financial pressure on the Pope to grant the annulment. The second act of 1532 was called the conditional restraint of appeals. This act meant that nobody could appeal to the Church in Rome if they were dissatisfied with a verdict made by a court in England. It was specifically designed to stop Catherine from appealing to Rome against the verdict that Thomas Cranmer was about to make in a divorce hearing. The process was escalated at the start of 1533. Anne Boleyn, having finally relented to Henry's advances, fell pregnant. This gave the process a sense of urgency since Henry was determined to achieve the annulment in time for the birth of his child, otherwise they would be illegitimate. Thomas Cranmer therefore performed a secret wedding ceremony for the couple in January 1533. However, Henry was technically committing bigamy as he was still lawfully married to Catherine. Thomas Cranmer then held a divorce hearing. This was a sham court since Catherine was not allowed representation. It essentially presented the various arguments, both the religious arguments that justified the annulment and political arguments that justified Henry's sovereignty over the matter. The divorce hearing concluded in May 1533, and at this point Henry was lawfully married to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn was then given an elaborate coronation on the 1st of June 1533. This included a great procession through the streets of London and an elaborate pageant that was based upon Greek mythology. She was then anointed in Westminster Abbey by Thomas Cranmer and given the full regalia as Queen. The expensive event was designed to show London and the rest of the world that Anne Boleyn was the legitimate queen and that she was carrying the legitimate heir to the throne. In September 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth to a healthy girl named Elizabeth. Henry had already printed the christening invitations that heralded a new prince, and you can see on the print where the letter S was added to denote that the christening was now for a princess. Despite Henry's utter disappointment, Elizabeth would go on to be one of the best monarchs England had ever known. So amazing, in fact, that I named my cat after her. At this point, Henry was at a crossroads. He could have seen the birth of a second daughter as a sign from God that his marriage to Anne Boleyn was illegitimate, and he could have abandoned all the work he had done to break with Rome over the past 3 years. Instead, the year 1534 saw even more radical steps being taken with legislation passed through Parliament that made the break with Rome permanent and made it treason to question the legitimacy of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. The most significant piece of legislation was the Act of Supremacy passed in November 1534. This act declared Henry as, quote, the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Essentially, this severed all ties to the Church in Rome. Furthermore, it declared that England was an empire, and therefore the King of England had full sovereignty over England's laws. This would have huge implications for England's future relationship with Europe, with many recent historians dubbing the break with Rome as the original Brexit. Historians have also seen this declaration as the theoretical starting point of the British Empire. The second most significant act was the First Act of Succession passed in March 1534. This essentially removed the title of princess from Mary and so delegitimized her. It then bestowed the title of princess on Elizabeth and made her the heir presumptive. If someone refused to take the oath, they were committing an act of treason, for which the punishment was death. Two high-profile statesmen, John Fisher and Thomas More, refused to take the oath of supremacy. As a result, under the Treason Act, they were condemned to death. Let's now examine Henry's motivations for the break with Rome, as this is one of the most important historiographical debates of the Tudor age. Undoubtedly, Henry's first and most pressing motive was to secure a male heir. This is why he continued to deploy scholars and theologians to research arguments to strengthen his case of annulment, even after the Blackfriars Court broke down in 1529. Furthermore, some of the early Acts of Parliament, such as the conditional restraint of annates, were designed to place pressure on the Pope to grant the annulment. I have no doubt that if the Pope had relented, then Henry would not have taken further steps to break ties with Rome. Second to this, members of Henry's court and Parliament were keen to see church reform. Church corruption was not Henry's main concern, but they were a concern for Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, both of whom were followers of Luther. Henry became persuaded to use these ideas in order to justify his break with Rome. This was possibly due to the personal influence of Anne Boleyn, who was a close friend to Thomas Cranmer. Furthermore, Henry could see that there were monetary gains from the break with Rome, because he no longer needed to pay taxes to the Roman Catholic Church. This is apparent with the restraint of annates, which became permanent in 1534. However, the main monetary gain would come between 1536 and 1540 with the dissolution of the monasteries, something we will examine in greater detail in our next lecture. Finally, Henry used the break with Rome to boost his own power as king, especially through the 1534 Act of Supremacy. In the long term, this would also help England become more powerful as a nation. Henry had been enraged by how Clement VII and Charles V had interfered with the most personal matter of his marriage, and how European politics had put the succession at risk. By breaking ties with Rome, Henry was giving full control to all future English monarchs to pass laws without being beholden to a foreign power. This is why it is in many ways considered the original Brexit. Let's now return to our overarching question of how did Henry VIII achieve an annulment by 1534? Firstly, there were new Protestant ideas emerging from the continent, sparked by the 95 Theses of Martin Luther. These provided a theological basis by which Henry could justify breaking away from the Church and so granting his own annulment. However, he would not have taken this road by himself. He was heavily influenced by key Lutherans at court, Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Cromwell, and Anne Boleyn. It took from 1530 to 1534 to fully break ties with Rome. There were key Acts of Parliament that made the break with Rome legitimate. There were also some fairly dubious events, such as Henry and Anne Boleyn's wedding before the official annulment had taken place. However, by the end of 1534, it was treason to dispute that Anne Boleyn was Henry's legitimate queen, and it was also treason to dispute that Henry had full sovereignty over the English Church. Finally, it is worth noting that Henry's motivations shifted, as he had to take increasingly radical steps to secure his annulment. By 1534 it is fair to say that the Acts of Parliament were less about Henry's marriage to Catherine and more about Henry enforcing his own power over his people, and using the Treason Act to deter anyone from questioning his authority. Thank you for watching. Tune into my next lecture to learn about the next step in the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries from 1536 to 1540.